I thought I was giving my daughter the biggest gift of her life, a small cafe where she could start fresh. But when I arrived, I couldn't believe my eyes. She was on her knees, scrubbing the floor, tears streaming down her face, while her mother-in-law sat in the front, laughing and acting as if she owned the place. My blood ran cold. All the hopes I had for her were being crushed in front of me. How did it come to this? What could I do to stop it before it was too late? Before we continue, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more interesting revenge stories. I parked my car outside the small cafe I had worked so hard to give my daughter. My heart was full of pride. Ada had always dreamed of running her own place, and finally she had it. But the moment I stepped inside, my chest tightened and my stomach sank. Ada was on her knees, scrubbing the floor with tears streaming down her face. Madame Grace, my daughter's mother-in-law, sat in the front, her arms crossed, watching Ada work as if she were a servant. She didn't even glance at me. Instead, she laughed, loud enough for the few customers in the cafe to hear. "You call this cleaning?" she shouted. "Do it properly, or I'll show you how it's done." Ada flinched at every word, wiping the sweat and tears from her face as she obeyed. My blood boiled. This was supposed to be her dream, her safe place. And here she was, humiliated, while Madame Grace acted as if she owned the world. I wanted to rush forward, to grab Madame Grace and demand she leave. But I stopped myself. I needed to see the full picture first. I needed to understand how it had come to this. Ada avoided my eyes, embarrassed, ashamed. Her hands shook, and she dropped the rag once, quickly picking it up before Madame Grace could notice. I could feel the anger building in my chest, but more than that, I felt fear for her, for what she was enduring every single day. I took a quiet step closer, trying to speak, but Madame Grace's sharp eyes caught mine. She smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. "Ah, so the father has come to see how his little daughter manages her shop?" she said mockingly. "Don't worry, sir. I'm taking good care of her." I wanted to speak, to tell her exactly what I thought, but my voice froze. Instead, I watched. And what I saw made my heart ache in a way I had never felt before. Ada's smile, small, almost invisible, was gone. Her spirit, which had always been bright and determined, seemed crushed. The cafe was quiet, except for the clatter of plates and the occasional cough from the few customers who didn't know the real story unfolding before them. I knew then that this was bigger than just one bad day. This wasn't just Madame Grace being annoying or overbearing. She had taken over completely, making Ada work for nothing, mocking her, controlling everything. My mind raced. How long had this been going on? How much had my daughter suffered in silence? I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. I had to think, I had to plan. But one thing was certain. I would not let her go through this any longer, not under my watch. And that's when I realized I had to act. Before I saw Ada crying behind that counter, I had no idea how much she had been struggling. Let me take you back to the day I first handed her the keys to the cafe. She ran her fingers over the wooden counter, her eyes sparkling. "Dad, I can't believe this is really mine," she said, almost whispering. Her voice shook with excitement. I felt a surge of pride. I had saved for years to give her this chance, her own place, a fresh start. Tunde, her husband, stood behind her, smiling quietly. He seemed happy enough, but I noticed the way he kept glancing at his mother's old warnings. Madame Grace had visited the cafe once or twice in the beginning. She came with advice, gifts, and helpful suggestions. At first, it didn't seem dangerous. I thought she was being kind, but then little things began to happen. A new shelf would be moved without Ada's permission. Ingredients were replaced. Prices were changed. Slowly, the cafe started feeling less like Ada's and more like Madame Grace's. I remember the day Ada called me in tears for the first time. She tried to hide it, saying she had spilled coffee on the counter, that it was nothing. But when I saw her later, the truth was clear. Madame Grace had been watching her every move, criticizing, ordering her around, taking over tasks Ada had prepared for herself. Ada's face was pale, her hands shaking. I wanted to storm over there immediately, but I had to be careful. I had to know exactly what I was dealing with. Tunde, poor man, did nothing. He loved Ada, but he feared his mother. I could see it in his eyes, the hesitation, the guilt. Every time Ada tried to explain, he would nod, whisper something, and then retreat. That hesitation gave Madame Grace power, power to control, power to humiliate, power to make Ada doubt herself. And here's the thing that kept me awake at night. Ada was trying so hard to make it work. She wanted to believe Madame Grace's words, that this was for her own good. She worked long hours, cleaned, served, and smiled, all while hiding the exhaustion behind her eyes. It was quiet, too quiet, and that quiet made me even more suspicious. I began to watch, to notice the subtle ways Madame Grace had taken over, the way she decided the menu, the way she moved Ada's decorations, the way she made jokes at Ada's expense in front of customers. My blood boiled, but I had to stay patient. If I rushed in, it could get worse. I needed proof. I needed strategy. The suspense was unbearable. I knew every day Ada suffered, Madame Grace's grip on the cafe tightened. And I had a feeling something big was coming, something that could either destroy the cafe completely or finally give Ada a chance to fight back. I clenched my fists. The moment to act was coming. I just had to wait for the right time. I kept visiting the cafe quietly, watching from a distance, trying to understand the full extent of what Ada was facing. Each time I came, my heart sank a little deeper. Madame Grace had become bolder, more daring in her control. It wasn't just the cleaning, the serving, the endless work anymore. She was slowly taking over every decision, every corner of the cafe. Ada's shoulders had begun to slump, her once bright eyes dim. She moved like a shadow behind the counter, careful not to make Madame Grace angry. And the customers? They barely noticed, or perhaps they pretended not to, but I noticed. I noticed the way Ada's hands shook when she poured tea, the way she flinched when her mother-in-law clapped her hands sharply. Madame Grace had started to mock her openly, in front of everyone. "Careful, Ada, don't spill anything again," she would say, her voice sweet to anyone listening, but cruel in truth. Every word felt like a knife. Ada apologized, bowed her head, and kept working. I could feel the tension in the air every time I entered the cafe. It was suffocating. Then there were the small, almost invisible betrayals. Madame Grace began changing the prices without telling Ada. She brought her relatives to eat for free and even instructed Ada to cover their bills with her own money. Slowly, the cafe was no longer Ada's dream. It had become a trap, a place of constant humiliation. Tunde, her husband, tried to stay neutral, but I could see the guilt in his eyes. He knew something was wrong, yet fear kept him from standing up. Every time I tried to speak to him, he would avoid my gaze, muttering that Mother just wants to help. But I knew better. I could see the pattern. The tension built each day. I suspected that Madame Grace had bigger plans that would push Ada out entirely. She had the control, the presence, the cunning. Ada's gentle heart was her weakness, and Madame Grace knew it. I could feel it in the way she watched Ada, like a predator circling its prey. And I started to realize something chilling. Ada wasn't just tired or unlucky. She was being trapped, step by step, by someone who had done this before. The thought made my blood run cold. My daughter's life, her dreams, her confidence, they were slipping away before my very eyes. I couldn't let this continue, but I needed a plan. I needed proof, and I needed to be smarter than Madame Grace, or everything we had worked for would be gone. As I left the cafe that day, my mind raced. I had the same suspicion I had felt from the first visit, the feeling that something far worse was hidden beneath the surface, and I was determined to uncover it no matter what it took. I couldn't shake the feeling that Madame Grace had a hidden plan. Every time I watched her, every time I saw the way she controlled Ada, I felt a chill run down my spine. Something in her eyes told me this wasn't just about the cafe. It was about power, control, and humiliation. One morning, while I was quietly observing from a corner, I noticed a stack of papers peeking out from Madame Grace's bag. Curiosity and suspicion overcame me. I waited until she stepped outside to greet a customer and quickly glanced at the documents. My stomach dropped. There it was. Registration papers for the cafe. Madame Grace had quietly claimed ownership without telling anyone. Every day, Ada thought she was running her dream. Madame Grace had been rewriting the rules behind the scenes. I felt a surge of anger, but also a cold clarity. This wasn't a simple case of overbearing in-laws, it was calculated. Every insult, every task forced on Ada, every public humiliation had a purpose. Madame Grace wasn't just controlling Ada. She was preparing to take everything she had. That evening, I spoke with Mrs. Ojo, the neighbor who had always watched over Ada from afar. She hesitated at first, but then admitted she had seen Madame Grace do something similar years ago in her old neighborhood. Another young woman, another small business, ruined by the same pattern of manipulation and control. It was a blueprint, a cruel method Madame Grace had perfected. I realized then how dangerous this was. Madame Grace had no intention of leaving the cafe. She had every intention of breaking Ada completely. And Tunde, poor Tunde, he loved Ada, but he was trapped in fear of his mother. I could see his guilt and hesitation every time she gave him one of those sharp, do-as-I-say looks. The suspense of what would happen next gnawed at me. I had to act carefully. One wrong move, and Madame Grace could retaliate, possibly even ruin the cafe beyond repair. Yet, I couldn't let Ada continue living like this, silently suffering while her dreams were stolen. I started collecting evidence, making mental notes, observing patterns. Every smile Madame Grace forced, every insult disguised as advice, every order she barked at Ada, it was all part of a bigger plan. And the more I watched, the more I became certain that time was running out. The feeling I had carried from the first day, the same suspicion, the same unease, was stronger than ever. I knew that whatever I did next had to be precise, smart, and bold. Ada's life, her dreams, and the cafe were all at stake. And deep down, I knew the moment to confront Madame Grace was approaching. The moment when all secrets would come to light. I arrived at the cafe earlier than usual that morning, my heart racing but my mind focused. Every step I took toward that door carried years of worry, anger, and a determination I had never felt before. I had watched too long, suspected too long, and Ada had suffered too long. It was time to act. Madame Grace was already there, sitting at the counter as if the place belonged to her, and, in her mind, it did. She glanced up, her smile sharp and knowing. "Ah, the father arrives," she said sweetly, almost mockingly. I could feel the tension in the air, heavy enough to choke anyone who entered. Ada stood behind the counter, shoulders tense, hands gripping the edge as if holding herself together. Tunde lingered silently, his face pale, unsure whether to intervene or stay frozen by fear. And there I was, watching, calculating, ready to reveal everything. I reached into my bag and pulled out the documents I had collected over the past weeks. Proof of Madame Grace's secret cafe registration, evidence of the money she had taken, and records of her past actions in another town, exactly the same patterns of control and cruelty. I placed them carefully on the counter, letting the papers slide into her view. Her eyes flicked toward the stack, then back at me, disbelief flashing for just a moment before she regained her composed, controlling smile. But I could see it, the first crack in her armor. I spoke slowly, each word measured but sharp. "Madame Grace," I said, "this cafe was never yours to take. You have humiliated Ada, forced her to work for free, and tried to claim what doesn't belong to you. All of this," I gestured to the papers, "is proof, and now it ends." Ada's eyes widened, a mixture of fear and relief crossing her face. Tunde's lips trembled as he finally understood the truth. Madame Grace's smile faltered. Her confidence, built over weeks of control, began to crumble under the weight of evidence. I could see the truth hitting her like a hammer. Every customer in the cafe suddenly felt the tension, the shift in power. The atmosphere changed from one of quiet fear to an electric, tense stillness. I stepped closer to Ada, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. She drew strength from it, straightening, standing taller than she had in weeks. For the first time, I saw hope. Ada's cafe, her dream, was still hers. Madame Grace could no longer dominate, humiliate, or control. And though she sat there, stunned and angry, she had lost the power she had taken so carefully over time. I knew the battle wasn't entirely over. Madame Grace might resist, she might try to manipulate again, but for now, Ada could breathe, smile, and finally begin reclaiming the life and cafe she deserved. I had acted just in time, using the suspicions I had carried from day one to protect her. That morning, I arrived at the cafe earlier than usual, my mind racing with everything I had seen over the past weeks. Ada had been silently suffering for too long, her dreams slowly slipping through her fingers, while Madame Grace tightened her control. I had watched, waited, and suspected, but now it was time to act. I had collected every piece of evidence, the secret cafe registration, the money she had taken, and proof of her past schemes. Everything Madame Grace had done to dominate Ada would finally be exposed. When I placed the documents on the counter, I could see her composure falter for the first time. Her sharp smile cracked, and I felt a wave of satisfaction mixed with relief. Ada stood behind the counter, tense and uncertain, but I reached out and held her hand. In that small gesture, I saw a spark of courage return to her eyes. Tunde finally seemed to understand the truth, his hesitation replaced by a quiet determination to stand by Ada. Madame Grace tried to regain control, tried to twist words and intimidate, but the evidence was undeniable. The power she had wielded for weeks evaporated under the weight of truth. Ada's smile returned slowly, fragile at first, then stronger with every passing second. I realized then that protecting the people you love sometimes means waiting, observing, and acting at the exact right moment. By the end of the day, the cafe was hers again, not just in name, but in spirit. She could rebuild, reclaim her life, and finally live without fear. And as I looked at her, I knew this was only the beginning of a stronger, braver future. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment where you are watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more interesting revenge stories.